making a presentation to you. I'm Mike Stefopoulos. I'm the city manager for the city of Jacksonville Beach. As you are aware, this is a community meeting to talk about an urban trails initiative. Over the past couple of years, we did community conversations, and one of the things we heard consistently across all of those meetings is that people did not feel safe walking and riding their bikes to destinations throughout the city. And that even popped up in our business community. They wanted to make sure that people had the ability to get to their businesses either by walking or riding a bike. So we are embarking on a very long process of identifying where urban trails would be throughout the city of Jackson Beach. Our consultants will jump into the slideshow here in just a minute. I would like to make mention that we do have a couple of our elected officials here tonight. We do have our mayor, Chris Hoffman, sitting in the back row, and we have council member Sandy Golden in the back corner as well. And I think that's it for elected officials for the first round. So with that, I'll turn it over to our consultants. And again, thank you all for taking the time to come here tonight. Your input is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. My name's Jim Harriet with CHW. And I'll just kind of run around the room, have the teams introduce themselves from our group. Ken.
My name's Seth Webb. I'm planning with CHW.
My name is David Fuller. I'm an also Nancy
So I think that's it. So welcome. I normally like to move around a little bit, but we do have a Zoom element to this, so I've got to stay kind of close to the screen. So if you'll forgive me and don't tell my previous speech teachers that I'm stuck to a podium, I'll try and stay up here, and now I can notice where I'm at on the screen. Second point, we are recording this meeting. It is being recorded for Zoom, so you can go back and reference it later. And then as we get in, if the people on the Zoom part have questions, they can message those in. And when we get to the question and answer time, if they're not already answered, they're going to try and answer them immediately. But if they're not already answered, we'll go ahead and read them out to you so you can hear what their questions are also. Just some formalities on that. So we have about a 15-20 minute presentation and then open it up for conversation and questions and such. Okay. They told me everything, how to unmute it and mute it. They told me how to move it. They didn't tell me how to move the slides. There we go. It's the big arrow at the bottom of the screen. So real quick on the agenda as we go through it, we've done the introductions and stuff. I'll walk through the milestones and the schedule. It's been a pretty quick project and a pretty exciting project. We get through this pretty quick in terms of planning elements many times. We had a public workshop about a month ago, and we'll go over what we heard from that public workshop and how that related and relates into what you see tonight. And I'll do my best to kind of create that ribbon between the workshop a month ago and tonight. Mission statement and goals, when we get to that, I'll clarify that. That's something the team, the design team, the consultant team has worked around, but obviously it becomes your mission, your community goals on where you want this to go. But you'll see how it relates to the overall project and the mapping that we've done. And then we'll get into some trail types. We've cross-sectioned those and related those to specific right-of-ways, and we'll walk through those. And then we'll tell you where we're headed, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. So the schedule. Right now in the holidays, in the number 5 area where we're talking projects and priorities, we're working on that. We've worked on some grant applications and some of that work with Parks and Rec so we can get this project and these projects started. Up at number 6, second from the top, we're into the final design areas where we're starting to assemble those and starting to look at specific rights of way. And then the whole project comes out where we start having draft documents right after the first of the year. And then we start meeting with the council into January, February, and the completed plan in March. So One of the questions we asked at the first workshop was, how would we achieve success? How would the community look at success? And there were several things that jumped out, but the big ones were connectivity to the parks and different area attractions. We asked people to put notes or stars on maps or buttons or stickers on maps, and we converted those to stars and then tried to align this first run of trails to those. A bike ped priority was big. Safe from cars or separation from cars. This is probably the biggest challenging part. Driven around your community a lot, and it's a lot of streets and it's a lot of grid systems. So how do we fit that back in and make it so that people feel comfortable on these corridors? Multimodal, we'll cover what that means, and then lighting. It's one of the amenities, should be fairly easy to incorporate. We also asked the other side of that question: what would discourage you from using a trail system? And quite obviously, take those same answers and turn them 180 degrees, and that's where you're at, if it's unsafe. One of the things that jumped out was the motorized mode policy. At the last meeting, I had at least a handful of people come up to me and say, well, what about golf carts? Are you going to let golf carts drive on these? So let me address that real quick as we go through this, because it's one of the design pieces. Golf cart is a motor vehicle, and it's defined like that in the state statutes. When you're putting together a trail, at least in my mind, there's a scale of what's happening on the trail, and that scale needs to be consistent through modes. A person walking, a person riding a bike, those are pretty close. You walk at about 4 miles an hour, you ride a bike at about 10 miles an hour, maybe 12. Yes, you can go 15. And if you're a heck of a cyclist, you can go about 20, 25. A 25-mile-an-hour cyclist and a 5-mile-an-hour walker are not compatible. Those scales are completely off. Much like driving a car at 30 miles an hour or riding a bike down the middle of the lane at 10 miles an hour, it doesn't really feel very compatible. And golf carts tend to fit into that vehicle side. So we're not designing trails for golf carts. Golf carts are more appropriate on the road because of the scale in the system. So I thought we'd get out there and cover that real quick, because that was a big question that came up. And we heard the opinions both ways. Are you using these trails for golf carts or are you not? And we'll work through the policy discussion as part of the master planning and have all that policy laid out for the council when we start meeting with them. Proximity to cars. There was a big comment on separate these trails from cars. Well, we're limited within the right of way, and we tried to keep things within the right of way. The city can also acquire more right of way, but that's not something we built into the scope. That gets pretty pricey and pretty intrusive sometimes. So you'll see what we've done to alleviate some of those issues. Uneven surfaces is something we looked at. Poor maintenance is something that happens after these facilities are constructed. And then narrow paths. All those are addressed in the cross sections we'll get to. Points of interest, overwhelmingly in the survey, we came back, the first meeting came back where parks and recreation were the highest priorities. Beach access, obviously there was a lot of discussion about east-west routes, schools and connectivity to the schools, and then nature park and nature area access points. The other was dots on a map that related to shopping or restaurants or something like that. So we took all those and we tried to lay them out and tried to build a network that touched those areas specifically. We also talked about, I think the phrase is what's stuck with you from other communities? What has jumped out? What's been there? One of the things we did in the first workshop was put pictures and ask people to put what they saw as a perfect trail, a wonderful trail that would really attract them to riding the trail. So these are 4 trails that are right here in Florida that received the most votes. If you know where they're at, anyone want to guess? I don't have a prize or anything, but the top left is in the Orlando area. We think Baldwin Park, I think, was what came up. The top right is Miami. Interesting point in Miami. That's a trail that's on the beach side of the buildings. It runs down the beach, and haven't finished researching that. somebody in the first workshop said, well, the city of Jacksonville Beach has right of way on the beach side of the buildings in between the beach. And I can see how that's possible. I worked in a beach community where that exact thing happened. Implementing that's a completely different discussion and story. So we'll research it a little bit more and figure out what that person was really referring to and talking about. But it's a pretty cool trail, and the community came out and said, we like this trail. The bottom left is in Sarasota County, and very popular trail down there. I suspect you'll run into some of the same issues. I actually worked on the bottom left one. We went to put it in, it's in a railroad corridor, and the community came out and said, well, I don't want this behind my house. And that was the first year. Please don't put it in my backyard. I don't want to see it. I don't want people riding behind my house. It'll be break-in. I can tell you now that $1 million, $2 million, $3 million homes are listing the fact that their backyard is on the trail as a selling point. And you don't list negatives on the selling points of Zillow. So the bottom right is the Orange Trail, somewhere in Orange County. A little bit closer to the road, but you can kind of see what that looks like and that feels like. These are the things that dropped into our minds as we were working on corridors for your community. So to the goals and mission, there were two things that stood out for kind of a mission that we were working on for Jacksonville Beach. And like I said, this was a design team type of mission statement. Safe access and usability for all ages. Those were actually advertised when we responded with our proposal. Safe and usable for all ages. So every once in a while we would get to a design element or a thought, and somebody at the table would say, well, wait a minute, is that really safe? Or we would start talking about riding bikes, and bikes can do this and that and this and that, but that's not all modes. So it would pull us back to how we should put this together and why it's put together this way. Connectivity was a big part. You can see that. Accessibility, all users. Safety, that's the spacing. Creating a sense of place. In other words, what's the experience then as you're riding on this network? Multimodal, wide range of uses that are scaled together, like I was talking about earlier. And then the policies associated with that, that's another part of this master plan that we'll put together. So this becomes part of the community when development or redevelopment happens in the city of Jacksonville Beach. This becomes part of that and kind of drives how those developments and redevelopments work. So let's get to a map. This would be obviously the north part of the city, and probably you count it as the higher priority or the higher level, call it the backbone of the network. Obviously, you could grid this whole city out with trails on every street, and that would be a fabulous approach. But there is a funding element. So where would you start to put your funding first, and how would you look at it so you can get the most bang for your buck? We started out by addressing east-west routes, north-south routes that made the most sense to us. But that's one of the reasons we're here, is to get feedback on that. So the A, Bs, and Cs are defining different types of cross sections. So how did we do this? We looked at these corridors before the project started. Before we had that first public workshop, we sent teams throughout the city to look at different corridors and different routes, potential routes. And then we did a desktop review of rights of way and how much room we had. So those two combinations started to drive where these routes started laying out. Couple of points on it. This is an interesting area that we just couldn't turn away with when we were working on a plan. This, can you see that when I run that? You cannot, can you? Okay, you can't. There's a laser pointer. Okay, so this area here, everyone's probably going, well, what's that about? Why did that run out there? This is actually about a 1.3 mile ride, just a few minutes on a bicycle, you know, a little bit longer in a walk. But the reason that one jumped out is you've got these wide right of ways that we could work in to loop yourself around under the bridge and not have to cross Beach Boulevard, a fairly significant crossing. State route at that. State's got their particular issues with crossings and making them work well. Obviously, you could connect up and cross in areas where it's just easier to do. But as in terms of atmosphere, a kind of a placemaking type of situation, this seemed like something that jumped out to us as an area to go and get to. One of the other things that we tried to work in was loops. That was a feedback message that we've heard from the first workshop. Don't just create an out and back trail. In other words, don't create an east-west trail. I can only then go from east to west or west to east. Create a place where I can go around and have a ride. So everything on these two maps, this north one and then the south one, has that element of where do you go once you're on this network. So let me jump to the south one. You see the A's. The A-type route is a Greenway. Now, this is one of the biggest challenges that we see is true Greenway trails where you're completely void of vehicles is really difficult. There's a lot of roads, there's a lot of streets, and it wasn't planned for that. And you don't have the benefit of 2 or 3 railroad corridors running through the middle of your city that you can acquire and convert. But there are some areas that stand out. One up here is the golf course, and we have talked to the city, Parks and Rec, the golf course people, and they are open to running trails through the golf course. So we've done a lot of background research on other communities that have done this. And as a golfer, I was kind of surprised because there's golf balls flying around golf courses. And there's communities that have dealt with it in different ways. Some communities have just said, you know what, you're out there, you kind of raise your hand and head out. We'll be gone in a few minutes. Other communities have put nets up. So we're kind of working on that. So the concepts, you see routes through the golf course are really in concept only right now. We've mapped out the holes. We've got a picture of that, and we'll start laying those out to see if there's any ability to move people in around the golf course. The other area is at the south end of the city. This A and this loop here is an old landfill that sits out there. It has a Greenway route that could reach up into this north from the landfill up into the neighborhoods to connect those. It's kind of a unique area. I was out there again tonight and taking a look at ways it could be connected. So those are 2 areas that stand out. The B route is a separated corridor where you're separated from traffic, reasonably safe. The C routes the corridors are just a little bit tighter and you're closer to the travel lanes, but still separated. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those. These cross sections, the cross section here, obviously the Greenway route, this is the type atmosphere you're trying to create in these 2 areas. Separated, we think we can accomplish that on the areas on the map that are marked A. Just a more nature exposure, a route that's off, might be transportation related where you're using it to go somewhere, might provide access to neighborhoods, and but definitely a safe riding environment. You'd be completely safe in whatever modes moving through the corridor. We've called it type A and defined it as a Greenway. Type B routes are a protected path, where the goal on the protected path is to move the path as far away from the right of way as possible. If you on the actual diagrams of the cross sections that we drew up, that says varies. I would say you want to get 10 feet or more, and there are some right-of-ways that you have in the city where we could accomplish that. So one big question that probably jumps to mind is why would you do a sidewalk on a road that has a protected path on the other side? And it gets back to those modes of access and that scale of use. Sidewalk is excellent for a walker. If you've ever walked on a sidewalk though, you're side by side with somebody else and you come to another set of walkers coming towards you, or you come upon a set of walkers that are on the path in front of you, one of you has to go single file. You have to work your way around that. The multi-use trail doesn't have that issue as much. So we're trying to build a scaled trail that fits the need in the community. There are cross sections that we could work on where this sidewalk could be doubled up or replaced. By doubled up, I mean you have a 5-foot sidewalk, you put a 5-foot sidewalk next to it. Now you have a 10-foot path that's completely different atmosphere. I want to research that a little bit more with the team because there may be some issues with that. That center seam down the middle of the sidewalk where you butt them up against, they're not saw cut seams. It's an expansion joint seam. Has a way of grabbing bicycle tires at times. And I've actually been through one of those accidents where the tire comes to a complete halt and the whole bike just cantilevers over the top of itself. So we'd have to try and figure something out. I want to see what other communities have done on that too. So trail type B2 is a modification of the B and C type routes. You don't have a lot of dedicated greenways. So one of the things we worked on was how can we reaccomplish that dedicated greenway within the rights of way we have? The advantage you have that most communities don't is this incredibly dense gridded street pattern. There are streets and blocks and they're short blocks. There are some fairly minor streets that jump out. 8th is one of those. It's set off from 10th, the heavy corridors, maybe 10th with the industrial area. 9th is a very heavy north-south corridor. So instead of trying to fit a trail within that very tight corridor and get everybody conflicting with traffic and dealing with cars crossing bikes and bikes crossing cars and pedestrians there and just making it a noisy, active corridor, what if we moved over a block or two and then repurposed the right of way? And there's a couple of ways you could do this. One is just completely change it and say, we're going to put a trail down here. But there are driveways and there are access and there are cars that go down through there for some things. They're not heavily traveled. I drove 8th again tonight to see it at rush hour and didn't come across another car. I stopped at what felt like 1,000 stop signs, but there was no other cars on 8th Avenue. So there's an advantage there. And there's an example not too far away. You see this picture here is a repurposed street, much like that in Mount Dora. Kind of a unique cross-section that they came up with. You can see the one-way street here and a path over here with a separation that's about a 4 to 6 foot, depending on where you're at. So how do you get in and out of driveways? Well, you build these crossover points, use a different surface type, allow people to cross it if they need to. You could also take it one step further and shorten this up and provide one-way or two-way access in that maybe 10-foot wide path. So if you have a driveway 20 feet in, but there's nobody else on that block, you could accommodate that driveway with a 10-foot road that goes into that driveway, put the path and the rest of it. Now you've created more of a green corridor. It's something a lot of communities don't have the advantage of because they just don't have the grid streets that spread the traffic out like that. So type C is we've called an adjacent path. Lost the laser button's like the tiniest button on this thing. The adjacent path is going to be a bit closer. So envision those as I said, the protected path is 10 feet or more, pushing it as far away from the road right away as possible. the adjacent path would be 10 feet or less. Looking at your corridors and the ones we've mapped out, it's probably much less than 10 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, that type of separation. So how does that work? We put a graphic in that shows a concrete, that budded concrete, but ideally I think you'd want trails to be the asphalt material. Concrete's more expensive to install the first time, less costly to maintain. Trails or asphalt paths are just the opposite. They're less expensive to install, but more costly to maintain over the long period. These are some examples. This one is probably the worst case that you'd want to avoid as much as possible. We would try to avoid as we mapped them out, but in certain instances, you're going to be right up on the back of the sidewalk. So this one separated a little bit from the roadway, but maybe a 4-foot separation with some landscaping in that area. This is actually Buckhead, just outside of Atlanta. We've been up through there. It's a fairly wide path, I think 8 to 10 feet. And they actually put, because it gets close to the road, what you can't see is just off picture, the path kind of comes out and then tucks around. So as a bike rider or a skateboarder, you're coming at the traffic edge. So they created a barrier. It's a little fence type of thing that runs through this, I don't know, about a 2-foot separation. It's actually done very nice. I've been there a couple of years ago, and it's very well done. It's a very busy road, but you don't feel like you're right on top of the traffic. You don't feel like you could just fall off the curb. And when you're walking with kids, that's a big thing. There is a barrier there. So those are examples of that. And you have corridors, especially on the east-west side, where you just have to try and fit that trail in to work it that way. Let me talk real quick about the width of the path. There's different conventions. Typical sidewalk is 5 feet, maybe 4. Typically not 6. For some reason, they decided 5 feet was the perfect width. It's about 2 people wide. It's about 1 bicyclist wide. You can't fit 2 on a sidewalk if you ever tried to ride side by side on bikes. It gets pretty tight. Trails tend to have a minimum width of about 8 feet, maybe 7 if you're jammed into an area. 6, you get down to 6, it's starting to feel more like a sidewalk. 8-foot minimum, up to 12 feet. You can go as wide as you want, but the wider you get should be reflective of the volume of users that are on it at that point. 8 to 12 feet is the norm. So everything we're trying to fit in, widen out the trail as much as possible, but we're really focusing on about a 10-foot width. So as we work on scale cross sections, that's the number we're targeting is 10 feet. How do we fit a 10-foot trail through here? Let's see. Most of the examples that in the pictures I've shown you are in that neighborhood of 8 to 12 feet. There were other trail types that we're working on. Everyone's probably looking in the map and said, what are you going to do on First Avenue? Because that's one of the ones that's banging around in our minds. And we've come up with some cross sections. Cody's worked on some cross sections, and I've fiddled around with some cross sections. And all it keeps leading us back to is we really need to talk to the community and the stakeholders more about how we can handle that. There's so much pedestrian activity and so much traffic around those areas. How do we create a safe environment? And we have ideas that would be really cool, but they would be big ideas that we really want to talk with the stakeholders about. For example, creating a one-way street on First, eliminating traffic completely from First, going with a pedestrian type street. Did not put a pedestrian street cross section in here, but if you've ever been to Asheville, North Carolina, there's a little street called Wall Street. You can Google it. It's pretty cool. Lemon Avenue in Sarasota is another one. And it's basically from storefront to storefront, you have the same cross section elements. You have sidewalk, street, sidewalk, storefronts on either side. But then where you would have the curb and gutter, you take that out, create French drains so it's all one surface level. And now your street from door to door in the street is all surface. And as long as you keep the activity up in terms of pedestrians and bicyclists, you can allow cars to go down there. You can block it off for festivals and fairs and stuff like that very easily. Cars tend to drop their speeds quite a bit. You have ever driven Wall Street in Asheville, Lemon Avenue, the speed limit is well below 20 miles an hour, down to 15 miles an hour. There's no desire to go that fast. When I visited the community as we were getting started on this project, there was a festival downtown at the park, right on the water. And I drove into an area and we started going so slow as vehicles that people were just in and through the cars as we were down there. That's really cool. That's a really cool element that you would want on that whole corridor. It got to the point where I felt like I was the one out of place. In fact, I even looked at signs and stuff to make sure I didn't drive through a road closed barricade somewhere. And that's what you want. You want that level of uncomfortableness for the driver of a vehicle in those situations. So we're going to keep working on those ideas, and we're going to talk to the focus groups that Jason's put together and talk to the city a little bit more about what that means and how those look. That's one of the next steps as we get into the final designs through December. I have to admit, when we worked out the first schedule, I'm turning to Craig because we were talking about just how busy we are in working on stuff. I was thinking, December will be a low month. I'm going to write this master plan up at that point. And I don't know, it dawned on me today that today is December. So we're here, which is usually why I'm shopping at the last minute for Christmas too. That's all right. I missed a whole week before Thanksgiving. I went home and I turned to my wife and said, "You realize next week's Thanksgiving?" She's like, "Yeah, duh." I'm like, "No, there should have been another week in there." She goes, "Another week, Thanksgiving would have been in December." You don't need to hear all that. Then we get into, after the first of the year, all of this starts to come together. The documents start to come together. The plan starts to come together a little bit more. And then the final submittal and final document in March. So that's the end of the slide presentation. Any questions, any comments? Yes, sir.
Do you have any plans for expedited crossings?
The network, the question was, do we have plans for expedited crossings on the corridor? I would turn to the city and we'll help out and work with them in any way possible to do that. I can tell you the maps lined up to utilize existing signals in locations. One of the strategies, if you would be to get yourself ready as a community for FDOT money. Has anybody seen the Legacy Trail in Sarasota down in Venice? There is an overpass, a grade separated overpass on US 41, takes the Legacy Trail from one side of 41 to the other instead of going on a circuitous route around traffic signals. It was a $3.1 million funded project, unfunded project, but we had prepped ourselves up and approached the city, approached DOT so much from a county standpoint that when they had money left over, and they do, because they never underfund a project, when they had money left over, they look for a place to spend it and they want something ready to go. So one of the strategies we're going to talk to Public Works and Parks and Rec about, as well as the City Commission, is building that strategy into the thought process to do something right and allow the state to jump in and fill that gap. So right now, everything's lined up to the signalized intersections. There's also options that are at grade. Hawk signals is a strategy if we needed to go through that. And we would work with the city on helping that out if the city desired us to, but that'd be part of the plan overall, is how to cross 1A, 1A. It's a huge divide that we just have to deal with.
Yeah, I'm just couldn't be more excited to see what you've done so far. We've been needing this for a long, long time, no doubt about that. And one thing I should not quite get, was the series, and some of those are major roadways where we go.
Mhm.
The right of way and driveway. Right now, a little bit of how you handle the driveway.
Let me back into how we came up with the cross-section type. One of them was looking at the actual right-of-way that's out there. And this will be a big discussion point when you move into implementing this, I'm sure. I've been in Jason's seat, and you go out and you say, well, we've got 80 feet or 100 feet, and people mow down to the edge of the road. People see that front yard as right down to the edge of pavement, when in fact the right-of-way line goes quite a bit further back. Having that discussion with homeowners, that's one way to separate on some of those major corridors, separate the lateral distance, the trail to the edge. When you get to driveways, depending on the size of the driveway, in other words, the traffic volume, there is signage approaches we can take. You can stop the trail, you can stop the cars. You can stop both. You can move the driveway stop bar back. You can double stop bar them. Each one of those would be a specific project and how to do that. For the corridors we selected, we tried to focus on parts of the corridor that didn't have as much of that impact. So you see us in one area. Let me try and back this up. On 10th. On 10th in this area. We come down on the north map. We come down 10th all the way down to the bottom here, and then we jump over to 8th. And probably wonder why. And it's because less driveway interaction. If we stayed on 10th, 10th turns into an industrial area south of Beach Boulevard. And as a priority, there's a wide right of way, but there aren't any driveways. People are parked everywhere. And we just didn't think it was ever going to be a viable part of the network if it was something you did early on in the project. So a lot of those answers as to how do you impact driveways, how do you cross driveways, become site specific when we get out there. But we are looking at them from a planning standpoint. Okay, yes. I've been riding my bicycle around Jack Street for about 20 years. And the other thing was like it wasn't for I have thought in my mind about how to get across the road.
Trail type Greenway. So Jacksonville Beach Golf Course, A, B, projected path, trail type B2 straight verted. Here's the pier, and it goes through here to Penman, and it go trail type C adjacent path. Well, this is coming right down us. Protected path.
Right here?
Adjacent.
A lot of people use it now because it will reach out to you to the street and maybe there could be some additional trees a little more than but I would think that maybe it's another candidate for labeling it as a right way.
So for those that are on the Zoom meeting, there were 2 questions points. One was the very south end of Penman, I have that correctly, correct? As it approaches beach, is to close that gap and find a way across Beach Boulevard. And then as an alternative to running along Beach Boulevard, which is probably very tight right of way, look at Shutter as a corridor, correct? Okay. When,
What happens if you open that up?
That's what we're all open.
Okay.
Mhm.
Where's the meeting?
I don't know.
It's got to be at the
Up
rec.
in this area? So for those online, extending 15th Avenue across A1A, that's a good point. We'll look into that hawk signal at that location. Does everyone understand what a hawk signal is? Hawk stands for something, and I'm not going to try and explain that. I don't know. It's basically a pedestrian-only crossing
Where is this meeting being held?
with overhead signals, much like a traffic signal. So the signals are up overhead, they're not on the side of the road, and they're definitely there. They're signed a certain way. They're have signal indicators in a certain way. So somebody comes up, activates, waits,
Current
the
proposed
signal
corridor.
changes, stops traffic, and then the bike lane or crosswalk or whatever it is works with the traffic stop. So it's a high intensity traffic crossing at A1A. And there are some things, we'll look into that. There are some things you can do on A1A to even enhance the safety of it. And we'll make sure that they're aware of that or you're aware of that and take a look at that. Yeah. I haven't seen a hawk signal in Jacksonville Beach, and they're fairly, I wouldn't say fairly new technology. It's long-term technology. The application of that technology is fairly new in FDOT circles. So can't think of where I've seen one, but yes.
I have two questions. One is on Penman Road. There's going to be a road work project on that road. And I'm wondering, is there any particular constraint on Penman that prevents that from being a safe type trail?
So the question is on Penman, is there anything that restricts it from being an A-type trail? It's got the road in the right of way. I'm not sure you could ever get the trail far enough away from the edge of pavement to be what you would refer to as a greenway. Greenway is, there's nothing around you. You're in the corridor, you're in the trees, you're in the nature element, riding on a trail is how we've defined greenway. It could definitely be a protected, a B category trail. And then you try and push it as far away from the edge of pavement as possible.
And that is my second question is whether if you're a B2 or C, is it safe to say that the minimum for all three lanes is at least 8 to 12 feet of pavement or whatever, and divided by 4 feet at minimum from past to road? All three of those.
So to restate the question, for A, Bs, and Cs, for B, B2, and C, would the path be 8 to 12 feet and separated at least a certain distance? Generally, yes. But with the built right-of-way the way it is, there might be areas where that path comes closer than 4 feet from the edge of pavement. But I think the goal always is at least 8 feet, target for 10 to 12. Did that? Yes.
Back on there about Penman Road. Penman Road from Beach Boulevard to the there's jurisdiction of Jacksonville, you know.
Mhm.
No, they have a plan for 3 year path. Not really called it, but it's a wide path. I think it'll be
Mhm.
wide. We have a person from Jacksonville that you were talking to the conference, right? And the internet that we would have someone with Neptune Beach. Because it'd be nice to have a lot of these trails
Right.
meet with other cities. Or putting it with other cities, like when you're coming through Seagate, and on the other side of Seagate, is Neptune Beach. But Neptune Beach is playing here. You know, we want to kind of work together, say, hey, we're going to meet on two roads or wherever. But my main question is, are we talking with these other cities, especially Jackson? We've got to have plans for that corridor on from Beach Boulevard to Airport. And so, yeah, I think they're paying for it. So that's kind of how Jacksonville Beach is written. One other thing I'll bring up too, for your description of Greenway, what I understand Greenway is the Greenway Trail from Maine to Key West. And their definition of Greenway is a little different.
Mhm.
We have the Greenway, it goes down First Street, it's bicycle Greenway, goes all the way down to the Foot Boulevard, turn to the left, and they put the Greenway section all the way up to the end. So that's the section of the official Greenway for that main.
Right.
I was wondering if you're coordinating with those guys, too. That's an interconnected Greenway from Maine to West.
So the question for those online, are we coordinating with Neptune Beach to the north, the East Coast Greenway, I believe is the name of the organization along the coast, as well as the consultant? The answer to that question in simplest terms is yes, or yes, we will. We've looked at the East Coast Greenway, and there are specific requirements. Really kind of surprised me that they want a separated, dedicated corridor. So, and it's real specific. So bike lanes and bikes in the street basically are not part of the corridor. It won't get designated as part of the East Coast Greenway if that's what it is. That's not a. Yeah, and I'll have to look at how they did that. Yeah. So I'll have to look at that so that it can become part of the designation. We'll talk to Jason about that. We'll talk to the city about that. It's that separated, dedicated trail that is not. And I couldn't find where they basically had a design element to say you must be separated by 4 feet or 10 feet or 15 feet. So we'll look into that. But basically your question answered yes. Yeah. You and Mhm. Grant application went today, correct? You guys, yeah. So I think that was one of the projects that was finalized on. That was one of the ones that we laid out there. And so, yes, the question, yes, the question was, have we looked at Brownfields funding for the old landfill? And the answer is yes. And an application has been made. Here, and then we'll go back here. Maybe. Every intersection is kind of unique in how it's going to work. My recommendation would be where you're prioritizing trail use, the vehicles have to give way. With that said, as a person who might ride on these, it's going to be real hard to cross a street without stopping or coming down to a pause, waiting for those vehicles to stop. But generally speaking, your question was, will there be four-way stops in some of these areas? Yes, I'm sure we'll end up with four-way stops, but for high priority trail use, we would focus the corridors and prioritize the traffic on the trail over the vehicles in many cases. That's what makes it so difficult sometimes for FDOT, because they're in the business of moving cars. So that's why those conversations are always difficult. There was somebody back here, and then we'll.
I just wanted to mention, about interaction of pedestrians and bicyclists on some trails. And it's a local custom, it has to be about where people respect each other's position and then, really good. But I was worried to Monterey, California, and the Oceanside Bike Trail there. There's plenty of people walking and the bicyclists and people working out, and it's really a pretty nice scene. All up from Pacific Road and to the southern part, the northern part of Northern Road.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So the comment was about pedestrians and bicyclists on the trail. Monterey's got a good example of that. Yeah. And there's other ways of handling that. On the trail I worked in Sarasota County, we had to put a speed limit on it because it was long straight railroad corridor, and cyclists like to hop on it and set their times over a certain number of miles. And we had a bad accident between a cyclist moving at about 22, 25 miles an hour and a pedestrian. And it was serious. I mean, broken hip and broken wrist. So you're right. So next. Yep.
Along the lines of the tunnels, I would explore that a little bit further also. Look down.
Mhm. So the question for those online was, how do you accommodate two-way bike traffic in a roadway that's one way? And there are many examples of that, and it's a traffic engineering problem that you have to solve. It can be done and is done. It usually involves some form of separation in how you line up the lanes and make sure that the contraflow bicycle is on the right or proper side of the travel lanes. And Mount Dora had that example. So that bottom right picture is what you're basically describing. This one down here, this is one-way traffic, and this is a two-way bike path, basically bike ped multi-use path. And they use it for walking. I mean, you see a bicyclist on it there, but in Mount Dora, you'll see people out walking on that corridor also. So it's really that separation, and then the signage that goes with it, and then how you handle the intersections. Those are all design elements that we would have to work through. Yes.
You know, we got a little bit of traffic mentioning about how to go through. If I look at that south map, and we just kind of told where
Mhm.
Because they also, if the longer term Greenway project, Greenway project, might be all the way to the water. So I think we have a
Okay.
conversation, we should definitely drop it down. Just a general question, your introduction was really good, but it was happening in the way. Pedestrians and bicycles from motorized vehicles. My question is, we already have in state statutes rules about pedestrian traffic and bicycles on sidewalks. How, by naming these trails and paths, would they be appropriately applied to statutes like this, or have to be written by the local?
So the question is with the state laws with regarding bicycles on sidewalks and whether they're permitted or not permitted, and how would that law apply to the trails? The answer is the trails are something different. There's always in the past been sidewalks and roads. The trails kind of fit in between that. And you have to sign them right, you have to approach them right, you have to get them to the streets right. That's allowed, that's okay. The rules, state rules against bicycles on sidewalks is kind of nuanced in a different way. You're allowed to ride a bicycle on a sidewalk, but you have the caveat in very basic form is if you're riding on a sidewalk, you have to be like a pedestrian. So when you come to a cross street, you have to act and do what a pedestrian would do at that cross street. You have to stop with the traffic, you have to move with the ped light or move with the flow of traffic. If you're in the bike lane as a bicyclist, now you're a vehicle and you have to act like a vehicle. It's an interesting nuance in there, but the idea is to build the trail system and design it so that it's comfortable and usable in a safe environment for all those users.
There isn't any state statutes that you're familiar with trails. So how would it be funding happen?
Right.
So how do you know who's writing these laws? What are the rules that you write about trail? What do the local authorities have to write about?
There may be some local ordinances that you need to address, but definitely not mandated local ordinances. Like I said, a speed limit many times is one. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever gotten a ticket for riding too fast on a trail, but it tends to focus cyclists off the trails and onto the streets. And cyclists are, those are the people that strap their toes into the pedals and they take off and they don't want to stop. They just want to ride and ride fast, fast for a bike anyways. So we would look through those on a specific basis in a specific location, and every intersection, every time you come to an intersection, you have to analyze that and make sure it's a logical approach, notification to both the cars and the trail users. There could be different answers all the way down the trail, but it uses the same logic that motor vehicles and pedestrians use today. So it shouldn't be foreign to anybody. MUTCD, Florida Green Book. Yeah. Yeah. And there's some common courtesies that you start to learn. Coming up on your left is a good phrase. If you're coming up behind the person and you're moving a bit faster than a walker, on your left, if you're a trail user, that's a common phrase you get to know, and know and understand and get to use. But it works. So. Any other?
Do you have handouts with how it's available online?
We can, somebody help me on the.
I'll talk up here. So we're gonna make that, so we've recorded the presentation. Wait, let's go back to just one. Yeah. So we've recorded the presentation that will be posted. So keep an eye on the city's website, but we will post the presentation, both the recording and the slides so that you guys can take a look at these. Also, if you see there on the bottom, that's an email address for the project. So if you guys have any questions, further comments, ideas, please reach out. That's a great place to share with us any questions or anything that hits you after you go home. The email, I believe so. If not, we'll make sure it is. Yeah.
We'll talk to the communications person at the city and make sure he's got access to that. We'll also be sending out a survey in general, some questions. One of the big parts of this project is branding and wayfinding and how that works. So our graphics people will be asking some questions about, how do you see getting around the trail system and what signage and such. We'll also ask some design element questions and stuff about the network and maybe some follow-up questions on what came up in this meeting. Is there, oh, yeah.
You said this trail system is going to be for cyclists and pedestrians.
So that's one of the parts. The question to those online was, this is for this trail system for pedestrians and bicyclists, no motor vehicles. We want to talk about that with the city commission a little bit more, talk about it with the stakeholders, because there's now a whole realm of other stuff that might fall under motor vehicles that never has before. E-scooters, segways, all of them moved by some form of motor. When I'm looking at it from a scale standpoint. A scale of a Segway down a trail is not out of scale with a pedestrian or a bike rider on a trail. You're moving 10 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour, like we were saying earlier. A golf cart just doesn't fit. A cyclist strapped in and riding 25 miles an hour just doesn't fit with the scale of the other things. But there are now a lot of motorized items you can get out there that fit more on the smaller scale, the multi-use scale of pedestrians and bicyclists than has ever been out there before. Yeah. Yeah.
That would be the path where that would allow bikes to take off our own feet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What I was trying to point out, that's actually part of Seattle's trail network. What I was trying to point out with that picture more than anything else was there's places in a type C trail where that trail might have to come right up to the back of sidewalk to fit. By design, that's not the best experience. At worst, we're trying to space out like Buckhead has done on the picture just to the left. And ideally you'd want to be, 5 to 10 feet separated. Yeah. Right. Exactly. You might come up to an intersection. There might be a building there. Power poles. Sometimes you run into a fairly significant large power pole you have to work around. It's $200,000 to move it, or it's $5,000 to scrunch the trail down. Those are the type of value engineering questions you do. So that question was related to not the desire to have a trail system up to the back of the back of the curb on cross sections. Right. Do you have any online? Any online? We pretty much got them. Okay. And it's,
We were going to do a second presentation. We've only had a couple of people come in. We do have printouts and enlargements of some of the stuff you've seen here. If anybody wants to kind of look at some of those maps, and maybe we can run through the presentation for those that want to kind of a little bit to hear some of the stuff they might have missed. Sorry. And we'll be posting it online. Yes. So
how many people are here for the second presentation at 6:30? Okay.
yeah,
Is that
so we're
it?
happy- I
Just-
mean, if
just
there are
one
more
came in?
questions-
Okay.
6:30 is not popular.
Yeah.
Penman Road as well as Penman is a county road.
And to those online, there was a brief discussion in the room about coordination with the other cities. When you look at the map, it stops at the city line. And we did that because if we had drawn, I was worried if we drew a map or even an arrow, somebody in the room, somebody somewhere would go, the city of Jacksonville Beach is not funding a trail in Neptune Beach, right? Just to, obviously those will line up, and we're definitely trying to do coordinate them in that way. Mhm.
Any other outside sources of funding besides this? $1 of the grant besides the Brownfield. Any other funding that whatever you do.
So the question is there any other funding? And I'm assuming, are we looking at that? The answer is yes. The state has funding for trails, and they award those out to communities. That's one source. There are various other trails, the Trails Conservancy and other groups. Sometimes those come with stipulations, but those are possibilities. Local funding, many of those programs need a match, some type of funding and match, whether it be in cash or in kind services, sometimes right of way, if the city has right of way. So yes, we are looking at funding. It's actually part of the master plan that we lay out different opportunities for funding. And in this first slide, you saw CHW is the firm I'm with. AIRS specializes in funding, and that's why they're on the team. Right. Right. One of the big things about getting money from agencies is that you've got a plan, you know where to spend it. And then one of the key elements sometimes to the state is being lucky and having a relationship where you can draw on funding that they have available. So they finish another project, and the way I obtained 3.1 million one time was just kept pestering them on an idea. They finished a project elsewhere in the district, and they had $3.2 million left over. And they came and said, do you have a project ready to go? I said, yes. Can it be under 3.2? Yes. We ended up with an overpass, a grade separation. Because they don't want to give money back. Yeah, they never want to give money back. Mm-hmm.
Some of the cities, Jacksonville Beach cities, will go out and find this money. And then say, well, okay, I don't have it. Gotta get it done. Then it goes back to Jackson Beach. Fire expires. We have somebody on top of it, like, this guy's giving us $2 million. We can make sure we make that line. We have somebody.
I'd turn to Jacksonville Beach for that, but you know,
Okay.
I can,
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
so there was a question online about at what point do we find out which side of the road will be affected by the paths, which side of the road we be putting the paths on. That's in our next phase. As we get into cross sections, we'll be able to delineate where those paths will go, which side of the street it'll be on. I can tell you some of that work's been done on every one of the corridor maps, at least from a single point standpoint. In other words, we looked at one spot on the corridor and said, where would the path go in this area? Is there room for it? We would want to do more work like that. And that's part of this next month's work to finish and accomplish that. And it's getting a little noisy in the room. So we've concluded the presentation, speaking to those online, and it's getting noisy to where now there's nobody sitting in front of me. If there's any other questions, text them into Seth or message them into Seth. If not, our contact information was on the slide and connected through the email. If you send it to that email on that last slide, it does come to my email box. So Jack's Beach, utmp@chw-inc.com. That comes to my box. I get copied on those, and we will be sure to incorporate your comments, your questions, and answer those for you. One of the things we're also going to do is list all those questions and comments and provide them to the city, as well as how we addressed them or resolved them in the plan. I think we're good to go. That